23 and a half minutes past the hour. This is the Richie Allen Show, your Richie Allen Show, for Wednesday, November 28th, 2018. It's time to welcome back an old friend of ours to the programme. He is a distinguished CIA officer, served 5 decades as a CIA officer and briefed 5 presidents. You can read him all the time at his website, which is McGovern.com. That's McGovern.com. He's been in Europe over the last few days, and it's very kind of him, jet lagged and all as he must be, to come on this programme this afternoon. Let's welcome back to the show our old friend, not so much of the old, our friend, Ray McGovern. Ray, welcome back. How are you?
Thank you, Richie. I'm a little jet lagged, but I think I'm awake.
You're very kind. You could have said to me, put it off till tomorrow, but I appreciate you coming on. We're going to, by the way, folks, to read about what's been happening with all of the issues that we're talking about, go to raymcgovern.com, bookmark his website, put it on your menu bar and read it daily. We're going to talk about Julian Assange. Paul Craig Roberts was on with me a week or so ago, and like yourself, he was lamenting the circumstances which Julian Assange still finds himself in so many years after he entered the Ecuadorian embassy. Your piece, and the piece that you have alluded to in the New York Times, is excellent. A lot of really important questions being asked. Number one, have journalists just forgotten about Julian Assange, or is it more sinister than that? Do journalists actually care about what's happened to him?
Well, it's pretty clear to me that the ones here in the States, and I suppose the ones in the UK, have been instructed not only not to care about Julian Assange, but to be acquiescing in clear violations of our First Amendment, freedom of the press, to pin on him cockamamie charges of espionage. In other words, they want to get him. Why do they want to get him? Well, there are 100 reasons, but most people forget that one reason is that when Ed Snowden blew the whistle on gross violations of privacy in our country, of gross violations of the Fourth Amendment, and escaped to Hong Kong, it was Julian Assange that sent his representative there, and they got him out. And he was headed towards South America, where he's going to be having asylum. And that is, the United States withdrew his passport en route to Moscow, and he ended up there simply because he was stateless. Now, Ed Snowden was somebody that the CIA really wanted to get, okay, and they couldn't get him. Who did they blame? Well, correctly, they blamed mostly Julian. The other thing is, and it's more recent, of course, in March of 2017, Julian released leaked documents. Now, again, I have to tell you that he gets leaks, okay? And what that means is that people who are smart enough know that NSA intercepts everything that goes over the web. And so the only way to get information to Julian Assange discreetly is to copy it onto a thumb drive or some other external storage device and physically get them to Julian or one of his associates. And that's what this other person did, who purloined an extensive set of NSA CIA documents, which show the offensive cyber capability that the CIA has built with the help of NSA. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's called Vault 7. It was revealed in mid-March by Julian Assange. And when it was first revealed, it was an eye-catching thing because the press could not avoid running with it. One cyber tool enabled taking over a car and making it go 110 miles an hour. The brakes didn't work, and that's a really convenient way to kill someone. Another one allowed use of a South Korean-made television to monitor everything going on in your house or in your bedroom or whatever. And the mainstream media duly picked up on both of those. But on the 31st of March, and this is the killer here, on the 31st of March, Julian Assange and Wikileaks released what is called Marble Framework. Now, what's that tool? Ooh, that tool is so explosive that the New York Times duly submitted to the government, oh, we won't publish anything on that. And what was it? It was a tool that allows the CIA to hack into another computer or server system, disguise who it was that hacked in, and leave telltale signs, like little breadcrumbs, like, Cyrillic, or the name of the first head of the KGB, and that kind of stuff. So when that hit, they really were after Julian, and 13 days later, then the head of CIA, now our foreign secretary, Pompeo, called Wikileaks a non-state hostile intelligence service, and they've been really out to get him since then. They've been leaning all over the Ecuadorians to allow them to extradite him, and we know what's in store for him because one of his sources, Bradley, now Chelsea Manning, was subjected to the tender ministries of our deep state.
It's a dreadful situation, Ray. And is it? I know you know Julian. You've been to see him, and we've talked about that in the past. Reports that he was being mistreated within the embassy in terms of being denied access to the internet and other things. Are those reports true? Are they still true?
Well, they are true, and sporadically his lawyers see him. Well, the last time I know a lawyer saw him, Jennifer Robinson, was about 10 days ago. More recent reports indicates that he's sort of hermetically sealed in preventive detention, criticized as crimes by the UN on 2 separate occasions. And does that make any impact on the UK government or the Ecuadorians now? Not at all. So yes, his health is, I don't know this because I haven't seen Julian for for 2 years now. His health is said to be declining. When I saw him, he had this pallor, as if he hadn't been outside for 4 years. Yeah. I guess that's because he hadn't been outside for 4 years. That does something to you, not only physically, but mentally. This is torture of a kind. It's, solitary confinement. And that the civilized world will abide by this is, I guess, a testament to how deprived they are, how malnourished they are by the mainstream media on what actually is happening. And it's actually worse than that, because The Guardian, who profited immensely by publishing some of WikiLeaks material years ago, has turned against him. And this fellow, Luke Harding, I will spare the adjectives that immediately come to mind, but he's working clearly for the security services in Britain, MI6, MI5, what's left of it. And he's getting these incredible discoveries from the Ecuadorians. The latest one is that Paul Manafort met with Julian Assange 3 times in the embassy. Oops, they forgot to check. They're sort of sloppy, because the Ecuadorian president is on record as saying, here's all the visitors, here's the log, here are all the visitors that we, as doing the security in our embassy, have seen to Julian Assange. And guess what? Paul Manafort isn't on there. Neither are any Russians. Whoa! So the Guardian is already backing off. It's really, they're backing off in weasel wording and saying apparently and maybe and according to sources and all. You can see it. It's really awful. So what's happened? Well, as you know, as everyone knows, I don't usually quote Winston Churchill for, I'm Irish. But anyhow, he was right one time, and then he said, when he said, the truth goes around the world 1,000 times. A lie goes around the world 1,000 times. Well, the truth has trouble putting its pants on, or words to that effect. So the mainstream media will play on this. Will say, aha, see, Manafort, he met with Julian Assange. It's a bald out-and-out lie. And the logs that the Ecuadorian president has already served up as evidence show that, Manafort was not on those logs.
We can only hope, I suppose, that he doesn't end up in the hands of the US authorities. It's always reported on UK media, which you won't see every day, Ray, that, if he does give himself up, if he leaves the embassy, that he'll basically be arrested for breaching his bail conditions here. Whenever we talk about Julian, people ask me, and they know as much as I do, and I tell people, look, you know as much as I do. Is he better off to leave the embassy, hand himself to UK authorities? Would he have a better chance? What do you think?
Well, I think he's very judicious and he's very conversant with the conditions under which he would be kept. As bad as it is, there's a measure of freedom in the Ecuadorian embassy, as small as it is. Were he to be handed over to UK authorities, it would just be a matter of time before you're given to the US. And as we know, last week we learned that there is an indictment. There are charges against him. And this is what's really interesting. The New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, other organs of our press and media have profited handsomely by republishing WikiLeaks material. So if Julian Assange, the publisher of WikiLeaks, is brought up on charges for publishing material that governments don't want published, well, what then becomes of the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and so, whoa, well, some of those folks are smart enough to realize, ooh, this would create quite a precedent, a noxious precedent. And so what are they doing? They're trying to get Julian on espionage charges. Now, there they have a problem. What's the problem? There is no proof that WikiLeaks got their information on the Democratic National Committee via the Russians. Of course, WikiLeaks denies it. So does Craig Murray and other people who know how they got it. And what did the president say? What did President Obama say 2 days before he left office? Well, he said, and I quote, "The conclusions of the intelligence community with respect to how WikiLeaks got the, quote, Russian hacking, end quote, are inconclusive, period, end quote." So you have intelligence community conclusions that are inconclusive with respect to this key aspect, right? It's sort of important, isn't it?
Yeah.
How WikiLeaks got those DNC emails. Now we know how they got them. They got them from a thumb drive that was gotten to Julian Assange. But now, when did Obama say that? He said that on the 18th of January, 2017, and he had been fully briefed by what I call the Gang of Four, the Director of National Intelligence, Director of CIA, NSA, and FBI, on the 5th of January. So do the math, 18, that's 13 days after he's fully briefed on a document that says not only the Russians did it, but Putin personally authorized it. Okay, well, that document is exposed and briefed to the president. And on the 18th, that is 13 days later, he says, well, those conclusions are inconclusive. Wow. So what are they going to have to do? They're going to have to gin up. They're going to have to manufacture or conjure up evidence that shows not only that the Russians got it to Julian Assange, but that Julian Assange was complicit, that he was witting, that he knew. He was not just a, what they call an unwitting person, but he knew damn well. And so they'll get him on that. They'll bring him to the United States, prosecute him under a 1917 World War I law called the Espionage Act, and he will not be able to defend himself. Those are the terms of that act. So it's really, really serious. And the deep state, the FBI, CIA, and all those who have been thoroughly embarrassed by WikiLeaks have a very deep stake in what happens, and they're out to get them. One other thing that I could mention in this regard, I mentioned the Vault 7 framework, the Marble framework, cyber tool that lets you hack into systems and disguise who hacked in and blame it on someone else. Now, when that came out, Richie, you might be interested in this little vignette. I go on RT whenever they ask me. I go on other networks whenever they ask me, but they don't ask me much anymore. RT calls me at 7:15 on a workday morning. And I say, hello, this is RT, we want you to come in. I said, wait a second. You never called me this early, and I can't come in. You're not even open yet. Oh, yeah, well, we're going to use the Eurovision studio. Read what we just sent you in email, and come on in. Read it. Get on the the carpool lane of Interstate 66, okay? And then I say, what am I going to say? Call Bill Binney. Now, Bill Binney, for those of your listeners don't know, he was the technical director of NSA. So I said, Bill, they're talking about this Marble framework, which allows them to hack in and disguise and so forth. What do I say about that? He says, Ray, say this. Vault 7, of which Marble framework is a major part, involves 700 million lines of code. McGovern says, "Ooh, that sounds like a lot." But he says, McGovern, each line of code costs $25. Do the math, will you? It's a lot. So you tell them that I was there when they developed this program 15 years ago, CIA and NSA, and they can do magical things. And this is one of the things that could easily be done. Now, why is that so important? Well, you know this legend that it was the Russians that hacked in and left telltale signs like Cyrillic, Russian writing on some of these hacking incidents. Well, Bill and I, and this is surmise, this is not physics like the rest of our analysis, this is surmise, but we suspect that this famous shadowy figure entity, we use non-sexist language when we refer to Guccifer 2.0, he, she, or it, probably the real name is John Brennan, who is heading the CIA and put his thousands of cyber sleuths into operation to leave these telltale signs pointing to Russian interference. That's what we think. Now, we can't prove that. We can prove the rest of the stuff, namely that it wasn't a Russian hack at all, as Craig Murray says in his article today, dismissing the Guardian and dismissing this Luke Harding, who really, well, WikiLeaks is suing, and in this case, they have a very good documentary reason to sue, since the logs that the Ecuadorian, and I know how the Ecuadorians kept those logs. When I went to visit Julian several times, they take your passport, they log it in, they take your cell phone. It's very, very strenuous how they keep records on that. And Ecuador had already said that there was no Manafort on there, and so this is going to disappear, but not before millions of Britishers and Western readers of the fawning corporate media are exposed to the first lie. And, you know, one of our State Department persons involved in information once said that, the trick is whoever lies first wins. The others don't catch up.
Depressing, Ray, to think that the newspapers you mentioned sold so many papers on the back of the information given to them by WikiLeaks, information that nobody could argue wasn't in the public interest. Of course it was. We'll talk more about it, no doubt, in the future. And like everybody else, we hope that the end of this story for Julian Assange is a positive one. Ray, while we have you till the top of the hour, folks, go to Ray's website if you haven't before, raymcgovern.com, and support him. And support independent activists, researchers like Ray. There aren't too many of them around anymore, sadly. I want to talk about with your permission, the story that's developed over the last few days, this confrontation off of Crimea between naval vessels of Ukraine and Russia. Allegedly, well, it seems it did happen, Russian border guards fired on Ukrainian gunboats and seized the Ukrainian crews. Martial law has been declared for a month in Ukraine by Poroshenko. It must be pointed out before Ray takes the stage here that a couple of years ago or 3 years ago, Ray spent about an hour and a half with me Ray was talking about the history of that particular region, but also the history of the coup in Ukraine, the part played there by Victoria Nuland, the wife of Bob Kagan. It is brilliant. That's on YouTube and it's on iTunes. If you don't understand what happened in Ukraine in the last 5 or 6 years, just look up Ray McGovern, Richie Allen, Ukraine, and you'll find that. Ray, what's happening? Is there something very, very sinister going on here? Is this kind of more Russia baiting? Is this goading and pushing Russia to the point where Russia might react and might do something? How serious is this particular situation?
Well, I think it could be serious in as much as it could damage prospects for any kind of sensible conversation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Buenos Aires, where they both are located right now for the G20 summit. And this is probably part of the reason. Poroshenko, the puppet master of Ukraine, he's not his own man. He's one of the vassals that the U.S. has. And when John Bolton suggests, I don't like these summits, says John Bolton. He's the national security advisor to President Trump. And so, sometimes President Trump doesn't even let me into the conversation. And so, nothing good is going to come of this. So why don't you do a little dust up there under that wonderful bridge that the Russians just built over the last 3 years? Do a little dust up there, and you can declare martial law, and that way, by the way, you're not doing real well in the polls. 8%? 8% is not really good. So you can postpone your own election. And this could work out good for you and good for me, because maybe Trump will stop thinking about working out something with Putin, and maybe he'll call the whole conversation off. Now, guess what? Yesterday, Trump told the media, I'm thinking of calling the summit off. I don't like this aggression. Well, what kind of aggression? It's still quite murky what happened. But in such situations, one has to look at the facts here. And the facts are that these three naval small vessels of the Ukraine tried to get under the Kerch Bridge. Now, this is, I think it's the next to the largest spanner in the world. I think the Chinese have since built something a little longer. But you can imagine what a small detonation right under that bridge. This is my own speculation, but the Russians are very, very sensitive. This is Russian territory. It's a bridge between mainland Russia and Crimea. So here, the Ukrainians are asked to always make sure that they give advance notice. The Russians say they didn't. The Ukrainians, of course, say they did. In any case, they approached the bridge, and they were intercepted by the Russian Coast Guard, actually arrested. And this is going to be very interesting to see how it turns out. But, after 30, 40 years of instinctively disbelieving the Russians on such things,
ironically,
I'm inclined to believe the Russians, over any Ukrainians, especially the ones that are working with people like John Bolton. So I see two reasons, basically. Sorry to be so long-winded. One is to impose martial law, postpone the election that Poroshenko was going to lose. And the second is to cause the kind of mischief that people like this like to cause just before Putin and Trump are supposed to meet. And it looks like the latter will weigh on Trump's decision as to whether to start a conversation with or without Bolton with Vladimir Putin.
It's the lesser of two evils, isn't it? The idea that it's electioneering by Poroshenko and his backers in DC, and it suits Trump as well. That's the lesser of two evils. I suppose we'd accept that if that turns out to be the way it is. But you've got to factor into it, I suppose, the Syrian question. And it's amazing how quiet things have gone in terms of the UK media anyway, with regards to Syria. Ray, there hasn't been a word. Now, as part of my duties in producing this programme, I spend every single day monitoring several news and television and radio channels here in the UK, and there's been nothing about Syria. We know that the Syrian government and its forces, backed of course by Russia, is on the verge of total victory in that country. That's got to be playing into the minds of, in terms of the way they're thinking, the Zionist neocon cabal that has other designs for Syria and for Russia. How do you think that plays into what we're seeing with Ukraine?
Well, I think that they can be looked on separately, actually, in this case. When you look at why the U.S. is involved, and there are, I think, over 2,000 or 3,000 troops, U.S. troops in Syria, uninvited. What are they doing there? What do they hope to attempt to do now that the Syrians have all but won? And when you think about all that, you have to realize that you cannot look at U.S. policy toward the Middle East without considering Israel. Now, way back when, in 2013, when Obama was about to, quote, retaliate, end quote, against Syria for the chemical incident at El Ghouta in outside of Damascus, the New York Times bureau chief, her name was Jody Ruderin, to her credit, she went to talk to the Israelis and she said, now, these was very senior Israelis. New York Times bureau chiefs get to see the most senior people. And she said, now, what's your preferred outcome? What's your preferred outcome in Syria? And among them, Alain Pincus, who used to be the top diplomat in New York, he said, now, Jody, this doesn't sound very good, but our preferred outcome is no outcome. And she said, oh, s'il vous plaît. I mean, no outcome. Yeah, well, Judy, like I said, it doesn't sound very good, but, as long as they bleed each other to death, Sunni and Shia, quote, Israel has nothing to fear from Syria, end quote. Now, lately, there have been explicit U.S. policy pronouncements saying exactly the same thing. Keep the pot boiling. Doesn't matter how many people get killed. Keep it going. And that's, I suppose, why we have 2,000-3,000 people military in Syria. Now, the problem is that the problem for the U.S. and for Israel is that Assad has all but won. There's one pocket up there in Idlib province up near Turkey where there are a couple of million people and the insurgents, so to speak, the people that the Saudis and the U.S. and the Turks actually have funded and provided weaponry, they're there. And the question is, should the Syrian Air Force, perhaps with the Russian Air Force, do what the U.S. did in Iraq to the Raqqa, or should they work out something? Well, long story short, Putin worked out something with the Turks and with the Syrians, and so far there's been no major invasion. But that doesn't prevent the insurgents, so to speak, from fabricating chlorine attacks and blaming it on the Syrian government and so forth. So it's a powder keg that could be ignited at any time. And in this case, I think that the Syrian government, the troops that have been the support from Russia, will just clean the place out and do what happened in Aleppo. Aleppo, there were a lot of casualties, but at a much smaller magnitude that was alleged in the Western press. Syria is going to clean that out, just a matter of when. And then the real question is, what are those U.S. troops going to do? And the answer to that is, God knows. Trump doesn't know. Our military doesn't know. Trump said, I'd like to withdraw troops from Syria. That was 3 months ago. Then a week later, no, the military said, we're there for the duration. What's the duration? Well, the duration. How many years in Afghanistan? 17? Well, what's the duration? So it's a matter of keeping involved on the part of our military. They have a little stake there. They can react to other hot spots, but they have no business being there because, as the Russians always point out, we Russians were invited. You guys were not invited. And the UK, well, we just have to say UK is a vassal here. They'll do whatever the US wants. And of course, they have an MI6 that's very active in Syria. So we'll have to see how it all plays out. But it's looking much better for Assad now than it ever did before. Well, it has for the last 6 years. And the sorrow is, of course, that millions and millions of people have been killed or displaced. And, people lose sight of the fact that they're human beings. They no longer live or live a useful life with a limb lost. And that's, if we follow the Israeli preference, no outcome, well, that's real good for Israel. Who cares about the U.S.? The U.S. just follows what Israel wants to do in this area. And I do not exaggerate. But what about the people? What about the people? Nobody thinks about the people. And part of that is, out and out racism. They don't look like most of us. I'm talking about the U.S. And so it's a lot easier to demonize them, to make them the other, to call them a towel head or a gook or something like that, to dehumanize them.
I'll argue with you there. You and I don't often argue. I don't think we've ever argued, really. There might be some racism. I think, Ray, one of the things I've been very interested in over the years is the subject of desensitization, if there is such, if we can coin a phrase. I think while there are people who regard them as lesser people, I think for most people, they've become completely immune to the effects of knowing that millions of people have been murdered. We saw this during the bogus Iraq war, which wasn't a war, which was the sacking of Iraq. I think people have become immune to violence. You know, Ray, in the mid-2000s, I was stunned to come across a group of friends looking at a website that had actual videos of people being beheaded by the Taliban. Now, I'm no virtue signaler, but I was absolutely sick to my stomach to see what it was they were watching. And it took me quite a while to recover from it. The knowledge that this was real, it was a real video of somebody. But to them, it was just a curiosity. I think there's a lot of that. I think we've been desensitized to it because you look at Yemen, you look what happened in Gaddafi, Afghanistan. We could talk about any corner of the planet in the last 25 years. It's just a daily thing. Millions of people get murdered every year, slaughtered, kill each other in the most vile, despicable ways. And I have this feeling, I'm going to give you the last word on this, I have a feeling that people are they're immune to it. And I don't want to be right about that either, because if I am right, we're in serious trouble. Over to you.
Well, you are right. The question is, why is that the case? And I attribute it pure and simple to the fawning corporate media, the media that supplies the TV and all the information that these people have, and which they have come to rely upon as their only source of information. Now, I don't think our disagreement is very large. I'm saying that in the beginning, take Iraq, for example. You're right. It was an attack. It was a war of aggression. It wasn't anything short of that. But when Colin Powell was asked about civilian casualties, he said, we don't count civilian casualties. Whoa. And everybody said, oh, okay, so you don't count them. Well, that's as though people don't count. Civilian people don't count. And all I'm saying is that if you look at Vietnam, for example, and you look at some of our Middle Eastern wars, Afghanistan or Iraq, those people do not look the same as the policymakers making decisions in Washington. That plays a role. In Vietnam, they used to talk disparagingly about the barefooted gooks, running through the jungle. Huh? Right. We, of course, would be able to control them and to pacify them. Well, there is this arrogance, and I dare say it's part of what we inherited from the United Kingdom, and that is that we white people can work our will on people who don't look like us, and I see that as a racist thing. I see that in spades in our country now, still getting worse, and I think that people need to be aware from a human point of view that the reason they don't seem to know or care about other people is because at the beginning, those people are looked at as something less than human. And when you make people less than human, you demonize them like they've done to the Russians and Putin personally, then it's much easier to attack them. And that's a major factor in why so many of the public acquiesce in what they're told and what their governments are doing.
Well said, Ray. Listen, that was the last word. Do us a favour. It'll probably be the new year when we speak again. Thanks for coming on this year and sharing your time with us. No, I really mean it. And to you and your family, I know it's very early to be saying this. Merry Christmas, Ray. And thank God for the work that you do, you and others like you. I mean that. Thank you.
Thank you, Richie.